During the Greek debt crisis, Greece undertook a series of important structural and institutional reforms to stabilize its economy and restore fiscal health. These reforms included modernizing tax collection, overhauling pension systems, and enhancing public sector efficiency. In the labor market, Greece worked to improve competitiveness and foster growth. The progress for these reforms was closely monitored through rigorous internal mechanisms and robust international oversight. Domestically, the Greek government established regular reporting and auditing processes to ensure transparency and effectiveness. On the international front, the European Union and the International Monetary Fund provided valuable oversight, support, and technical assistance, helping Greece stay on track and make necessary adjustments. Today, Greece's economy is demonstrating resilience and steady recovery. The country has managed to maintain economic stability by continuing to apply and adapt these reforms. Austerity measures, while challenging, were executed with a focus on protecting the most vulnerable to minimize hardships. Greece's ongoing success underscores the relevance of these reforms and the monitoring mechanisms established, which provide a valuable framework for maintaining economic health and transparency that should be taken into account to build a more prosperous economic future. Thus, this session aims to explore how can other countries potentially benefit from such a vibrant experience.
We'll start right away with you, Mr. Harry, with a very quick overview of what happened actually in Greece, where we'll proceed next to Dr. Nikos and then to Dr. Rania. Okay, please.
Thank you. This works. Well, thank you, Dr. Abla Abdelatif, for the kind invitation, and of course, the chairman, Mr. Mohana, for giving me the opportunity to say a few words about the Greek experience, but also the opportunity to come back to Cairo. After last time, I came for the mummy procession, and it was a fantastic, excellent event. And it gave me the chance and the opportunity to see the kind of transformative project that you are going through as well in Egypt, ensuring that you bring in the cultural diversity that historically has resided in Egypt, is the crossroads of the world, and how going through sometimes painful transformations, you can keep the essence and the core of what it means to be Egyptian at the same time, because that is a difficult problem, the problem that we face in Greece, whether all those reforms, that was an ongoing discussion, were transforming us in a way that we will lose our identity or in a way that we will strengthen this identity. And I think the latter is the case. So just one word about my experience during the crisis so that you can see where I'm standing from. I used to be the head of the tax authority back in 2012 and 13, 14, which is at the heart of the crisis. And you mentioned that we made a lot of changes to the tax system, the tax collection, and the way that we think about tax evasion in Greece. So this is also a mentality transformation that we went through. Then I wasn't in politics back then. I left. I entered the parliament with a small party. Then I joined New Democracy. I became the Minister of Tourism. I had excellent cooperation with the minister back then, Mr. Khaled Elenani. And now, after being the deputy minister responsible for tax policy, so I came back to the same area. I'm now just focusing on my duties in Parliament. So Greece's financial recovery has gone through many phases, but in general is considered to be a unique global success story. And I hope that what we learned can be useful for your experiences as well. Our country has managed to return to normality after going through difficult phases and a very prolonged dealing with the crisis. Almost 10 years we had to deal with the crisis. But at the same time, we currently live in a world where we have polycrisis and multi-crisis. Polycrisis meaning that we have many crises happening at the same time. We have the digital transformation, the environmental, the energy, the security transformation that is happening right before our eyes. And all these global earthquakes manifest themselves in our different countries in different ways, but they manifest at the same time with prices going out of control, et cetera, et cetera. You feel it, we feel it in Greece. I think everybody feels it, but especially in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, those crises are felt, I think, much more acutely. And at the same time, we have multi-crises, waves after waves after waves of crisis. So certainly in Greece, this is what it feels like. We went through the financial crisis. After that, we had the COVID crisis, the health issues. This hit very hard our tourism sector. I was the minister at the time where tourism was not allowed. It was an illegal activity. And then on top of that, we have the crisis after that, especially the energy and the inflation crisis that we're dealing with currently. Now, we went through many phases. The first mistake that we made, and I hope that you don't do, is we underestimated the crisis. We thought in the beginning, back in 2010, the government at the time, it's a small one. Within 1 year, a year and a half, we will finish. We don't need to talk to each other, the different parties. The opposition can continue opposing and the government can continue doing what they want. This was not the case. It took much longer, much more focused effort, much more sustained effort. And unfortunately, this lesson we had to learn the hard way. Government after government fell, the opposition came to power and they found that they had the same problems. And the things that what they were criticizing, they were forced to implement themselves. So this is something that we have to understand, that the changes that we have to make, they are deep. And they are deep because they are not just technical changes. I know that we have the tendency, professors, and to focus on the technical details, but I think we politicians are an integral part of the story because we have to make cultural changes. And I will mention the connection of the Greeks to the tax authority. Traditionally, tax evasion it's an activity that you brag about in Greece. You're saying, you know, how you eat with your friends, you drink wine, and you say how much you've managed to escape and not pay to the tax authority. This is not the case anymore. Tax evasion is seen as what it is, which is an antisocial behavior, a behavior that's not to be proud about, but a behavior that you should hide and you shouldn't do. As a result, not just, of course, with that, but as a result of the digitalization efforts, I'm a software engineer by training. So the first thing I did when I was head of the tax authorities, push for more electronic systems. We have brought the tax gap from 30%, the VAT gap was 30% a few years ago, to less than 15% as it currently stands, and we're effectively closing the gap with the European average. So those changes are important. Second thing, you have to reform your budget, the way it works. Our government, for many years, did not have control of the budget. Many extra budgetary items, too many line items in the budget. Our budget had 1,200 line items. Nobody could control that. We consolidated those items. We had control, and the Ministry of Finance now has a lot of say on the actual policy details of the other ministries. If they want money, then they need to demonstrate the results that they will bring with that kind of money in terms of efficiency, in terms of increasing the kind of service they provide to the citizen, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the third element that's required if you are to make a success is, in our case, that was the case, was external supervision. We had a very, very strong, you mentioned it in your video, we had a very strong external supervision because, of course, external money, funding was involved. IMF, the rest of the institutions, the European institutions. As a result, we had missions. I remember I was never able to do any work. They would come to check on us on 1 month. The other month I had about 15 days, and then they would come again. So it was constant reporting, constant discussion about what we're doing, but it was essential. Now, the point I would like to emphasize is, do not just look at it from the monitoring side, but use effectively the kind of missions and the help that they can provide. There's a lot of best practices. There's a lot of wealth of information that those institutions can bring with specific missions. We had many, many missions for tax evasion, everything from organizational changes, how to structure our tax authority, what kind of changes we should be doing, how to change our property tax laws, etc., etc. So use the technical assistance, use those people that can carry a lot of information and in order to be able to do it. So just to not take too much time, what was the end result of all that? The end result is that we started with a huge debt crisis and a huge imbalances, both in our external balance and in our fiscal balance, and many, many problems with the economy. And currently, we have brought down unemployment from the peak of 27% down to less than 10%, so effectively back down to the historical levels it has been. Our external balance has improved greatly. It's not where we want it to be. We still have many issues. There's a lot of investment in the secondary sector, in manufacturing and the industrial sector, which is something that hasn't happened in many decades in Greece. We have gone through many years of deindustrialization, so this is also positive. With the way that we recovered in tourism, our tourism is at its best than it has been. We had a huge problems with COVID, and we managed to recover very, very quickly. With support to the small and medium enterprises, it's very, very important to implement Keynesian-style policies to support the SMEs when the times are tough. Our economy, especially since 2019, we took it with a growth of about 1/4 of the European average, and currently we are 4 to 5 times growing more than the European average. So we have made a huge transformation in that respect, but we still have some way to go, both in terms of judicial reforms and other kinds of reforms that are important to ensure that we have a business activity that is thriving in Greece. So Greece is back. Greece is open for business. Greece is welcoming people from abroad with our golden visa schemes and with investment schemes. A lot of fellow Egyptians. I live in Glyfada, so it's an Egyptian village now. So a lot of people I see every day, and it makes for a much more richer experience and much nicer experience, I think. At least this is my personal point of view. And I hope that we will continue this path, because the final word that I would like to say is that this is not a one-off. This is not a diet that you go, or a pill that you take and it lasts 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then you finish and you can continue going back the old ways. No, this is cycles. The next growth cycle of Greece will come only if now we implement more reforms, labor market, pension, other kinds of reforms, and in cooperation with the think tanks that they provide valuable insight. Professor Vetas was part of the Pissarides team, the Nobel-winning economist, created a team that produced a specific recommendation report for Greece in order to modernize our economy and to look at the 21st century with different eyes than the eyes of the crisis. So thank you very much, and I hope in this discussion I can elaborate in whatever else.
Thank you so much for your excellent opening remarks. I believe we'll have a presentation for Professor Vetas, and until it's on, your key messages are very clear. Not underestimating the crisis is extremely important. It's not only technical change, but there's also cultural changes and institutional changes, and if you fail, keep trying, try again. I mean, this is usually the system, how it works. I know Grifada is almost an Egyptian district at this point. Okay, so I hear, right? That the reform of the budget was a must, and the support for the SMEs during crises and lots of other reforms. And we'll come back to this, but for now, please, Professor Vedas, is your presentation.
Yes, so there are some slides I'm going to use, in some sense, give a more general overview of what Minister Theoharis talked about. But let me start by thanking you warmly. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm working the last 10 years at the Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research in Athens. We are a fully independent research foundation. We were created in 1975, so next year is going to be our 50 years. We do work with businesses for the government, if and when they want, and also research that it's important to talk to the general public and elevate the level of understanding of economics. Economics is not always trivial to understand, and it's very much interlinked with politics. Let me say one thing, and then I'm going to go there. I think it's going to be easier. But let me say why we may care about something that happened in the past. Greece was a massive success story around the time of joining the Eurozone, which happened in 2000. One of the fastest growing economies in Europe. And appears strong in many dimensions, certainly in the level of welfare and incomes. The crisis that Harris talked about was the deepest and longest crisis any economy has seen in the Western world ever. Cumulative GDP decreased by 25% in real terms. Unemployment went close to 30%. And 3 successive rescue programs were needed for 8 years. Following that, we have also had a period of very strong recovery and what appears to be a period of growth. So this roller coaster, in some sense, magnifies what other economies are also going through or may go through. So it's like a laboratory of other types of ideas that others can learn about. But with 2 question marks about the success. And I think I echo a little bit what both of you hinted about. There is one word, this famous and a little bit misunderstood word of reforms. In my head, there is no doubt that if the adjustment during these 8 years was focused more on the real economy side in terms of structural reforms rather than the fiscal, and if there was more consensus around these reforms, the time and the depth of the crisis would be much smaller. And certainly, looking ahead with all the challenges that we have around us, that no economy alone can solve, without keeping reforming yourself, in what direction? In the direction of opening up your markets, modernizing your state, empowering people who work, allowing technology to come into the production and the public sector. So, and this is a continuing process. This is not a one-off, for sure. So for Greece, this is the way ahead, but I think also for pretty much every other economy. But I promised some pictures, so I'm just going to go there. Okay. This is in 4 panels, the roller coaster of the Greek economy, starting in 2001, when was the entry into the Eurozone. By the way, Greece entered what was then called the European Economic Community in 81. It was the 10th member. The only other not extremely rich economy was Ireland at the time. Greece joined 5 years before Spain and Portugal. Okay, so Greece has always very much been at the core of European and other international institutions. So Greece abandoned its own currency, the drachma, in 2001. And if you focus on the first half of the panels, you can actually see consumption going up a lot. You can actually see even investment going up. You can actually also see the trade deficit deepening, because Greece adopted a hard currency. It was harder to export, and it was much cheaper, A, to import, and B, to also borrow money from abroad. So all this made the consumption balloon. You can also see that during this time, tourism was okay. In fact, in 2004, Athens organized the Olympic Games. And after that, there was also an increase of inflow of tourists into that. But when the crisis hit, and Greece didn't start the crisis started in the US with Lehman Brothers. It was a global financial crisis. But this very much polluted the Eurozone periphery. Not only Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Cyprus, Spain got into a turmoil because it was very difficult to correct your imbalances, also if you didn't have the painful but sometimes useful tool of currency devaluation. So this also, on top of it, attracted a lot more attention, global attention, in the sense that if these countries go down, will the Eurozone go down? And if the Eurozone go down, will the world financial system go down? It was all sort of top American people coming to Greece every month, checking that this is going all right. So it was not just a Greek matter. The long-term view, and here in these 3-4 charts, Greece is the blue line, is that Greece had been converging, as you can see, up to the crisis to the major European economies, but then it was a free fall. Okay? And part of the reason was that even though we had been investing in Greece more or less at the same level of GDP, around 24%, like the average of the European economies, much of this investment was going only to housing and not into productive corporate investment. You can actually see the lower line. So Greece was not updating and upgrading its technology basis. With money in our pockets, we could actually buy more, but we were not exporting more, and we were also borrowing more. And one morning, when with the global financial crisis, people started wondering, will these people be able to pay back their debt? And so the interest rates started going up, and that was almost a sudden death. Normally at that time, the IMF comes in, they open up their cookbook, and they tell you what to do: reforms, austerity, currency devaluation, normally. But currency devaluation you will not do. And some of the countries in the Eurozone at that point, formally or informally, they put on the table the question, should you actually now lose the currency that you have just adopted? And then the question, then what happens? Because if Greece goes out, Italy also had a debt, and Spain had a debt, and what's going to happen? So this was an extremely interesting, for an economist at least, case. I'm not going to read this. There were 3 successive programs in which the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF collaborated. That was the so-called Troika. And as Harry said, at the start, everybody thought this, or everybody was saying this would be a program that's going to last for a year and a half. It lasted 8 years. It burned successive governments. It forced coalitions, and it ended in 2018. On the real economy side, there was a number of successes. There was significant deregulation of a formerly overregulated labor market. So the labor market became a lot more vibrant. We cut the growth in pensions, which was excessive, and we tied the pensions closer to contributions. We opened up product markets. Tax administration was, as Harry said, he was there at the time, was created as an independent authority and used electronic filing. And there was a number of other reforms, for instance, in the healthcare system. Greece was spending close to 6 billion euros. Greece is a country of, it was a country of about 11 million people, so a small country, obviously. We lost 500,000 people during the crisis because they left. So now we are 10.5. So that's the size. Greece was spending 6 billion euros for medicine. Pre-crisis, post-crisis, it is spending 2.5. So you can see the rationalization, that the room that one had to do through reforms. So on the fiscal side, the programs were a success. Even early on, after 2 or 3 years, Greece actually exhibited fiscal balance. We cut expenses, we increased tax revenue, and we rationalized the spending. And actually, it was not very easy for people to vote for governments that would go to the parliament and they were going to tell the pensioners and the public servants, look, your salaries, your pensions are going to be cut 25%. Okay? People that were calling me on the phone from abroad, they said, are you going, through an unrest? Are you going towards a civil war? I said, don't worry, we're going to do it. So for the fiscal side was okay. At the end of the program, we had elimination of the fiscal deficits. But then the question was, if that was done in a way that was consistent with future growth, elimination of the trade deficits, but that was primarily done by reducing imports rather than increasing exports. So I'm talking now about 2018. Competitiveness was increased, but primarily through a decrease in that unit labor costs. We had some growth, but there was a question as to what's going to happen. And the success was that Greece stayed in the Eurozone. This was very important for the Eurozone. It was very important for Greece. But then the question was why politically this was even put in the table. Post 2018 and looking ahead, what we've had is that the huge decrease in investment that we saw is now starting to go in the other way. So the last 4 or 5 years, investment in Greece of all types, corporate investment, construction and housing has returned, is going up. Importantly, foreign direct investment, in which Greece was a lagger relative to other European economies, is also doing well the last few years. And in exports, we have started a significant increase in the exports of products. A lot of companies that were able to survive this huge crisis rediscovered themselves in the sense of starting selling to the global markets rather than selling inwards. They became leaner and meaner. And these companies are now driving a number of exports, which importantly, they have moved them up in the value chain. In other words, they are not selling as much undifferentiated products, but products of higher value. We need a lot more of that, however. Relative to economies of similar size, Greece is still the smaller exporter of products. So we have to keep doing this. You can also see industrial production going up. Post the COVID crisis, because you know, if you are unlucky, when you finish with 8 years of crisis, other crises come. The European Union set up a number of, within what they call Rescue EU and all these programs. One of the more important parts was the resiliency, the recovery and resiliency plan, which had two parts: grants. So the EU borrowed money collectively to show solidarity, and then it distributed this to countries. Greece got the larger share, A, because it had the largest needs, and B, because it showed the best plan about what to do with this money. For an economy like Egypt, this is not serious money, but for an economy like Greece, this is serious money. So there is an inflow of about 21 billion euros that is going to be used to modernize the state and for basic infrastructure, and another 13 billion that is going to be loans. So this is ongoing, and it will be ongoing for the next 2 years. All sorts of construction that suffered during all of this period is now recovering. Greece needs to catch up in terms of its ports, airports, digital infrastructure. And actually, in a recent study that we did in our foundation, we calculated that in order to do all of the projects that have already been signed and assigned to companies, the number of people that work in the construction sector, from chief engineers to unskilled labor, has to grow by 250,000 people that we don't have. Tourism showed a very strong rebound after COVID, and unemployment rates and the banks are doing all right. Summary: the Greek economy has been hit by a number of crises. The deepest crisis, as we described, in a long time. It is now very strong. In my view, it has not yet reached its full potential. Combining its European ties and its location in this area that can become a global area, one can estimate that in a number of sectors and in terms of macroeconomics, the future can be very strong as long as it increases and deepens its ties with the neighboring economies. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation and for a very clear explanation of what happened. There are definitely many lessons to learn. Now we go to Dr. Rania Al-Mashat. You've seen the full experience of Greece, so I'm sure you know, and also for many other countries. Your comments, please.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Abla. Let me start by thanking ECS for always being a center of objectivity and credibility. I remember ECS very early on pushing for monetary reforms on inflation targeting. And when I joined the central bank after the IMF, we started actually implementing a lot of that. So again, at the forefront of pushing reforms for countries. And thank you for the guests and colleagues on the panel. Greece is an example that is studied extensively by practitioners and policymakers. And there are several similarities, but also a few differences. And let me maybe highlight some of the elements as we talk about Egypt. We talk about, again, the successive shocks, how they have been affecting on the fiscal balance, the internal as well as external balance, and also what are the efforts that are being taken today. A key difference between the case of Greece and the case of Egypt is on the banking sector. The banking sector in the case of Egypt is with respect to the balance sheets and all of that, has not been in the situation that Greece was, and that exacerbated the crisis. So that's a very important distinction between both cases. The second point is when we entered 2020, once COVID hit, we had significant buffers, both on the fiscal side and the monetary side. And this helped us to a large extent mitigate the impact on the growth. And that was very, very important. The unfortunate situation is that we were hit right after by the implications of the war, Ukraine, Russia, and how that affected primary products. And Egypt is a big importer of wheat. So that was a key impediment to the continuation of a trajectory which would have been much smoother. And of course, what happened afterwards with respect to capital outflows and so forth. And then most recently, last year, with the impacts of the war in the region. So there is, just as the fellow panelists mentioned, you go on a reform path, but again, externalities push you in different directions. What is very, very important is the agility to basically shift with respect to your policies and be able to move forward. In the case of Greece, there was the Troika. The Troika was definitely the safeguard, if you will, with respect to the financing, but also the monitoring. And let me say that if I go to the case of Egypt, restoring macroeconomic stability was the key objective. And that's why in the last March 6th, when the central bank again tried to overcome the impediments in the foreign exchange market, that was a significant policy action in the midst of this crisis. And it was very, very important, as I mentioned, to restore macroeconomic stability. It was restored in two ways: fiscal tightening, and that is again a similarity with Greece. And second, the monetary tightening, to be able to restore macroeconomic stability and credibility when it comes to the predictability of macro policy. Macroeconomic stability is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. It has to be coupled with structural reforms. So that is a lesson in all countries that go through external as well as internal imbalances, that you have to get your macro correct. You have to get the balance between monetary policy and fiscal policy to be able to restore that very important confidence. And that confidence is not just for the investors, but it's also very, very important domestically, because that again affects and anchors expectations, which are key if we're going to talk about growth. So that's the first element. The second element are structural reforms. And let me mention the three pillars of structural reforms, because they are very much linked to how we see the growth story going forward. In the opening remarks, it was mentioned the relationship between Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus when it comes to energy. So energy for us is key. And the three pillars of structural reforms include continuing the macro fiscal resilience, and a list of reforms with respect to fiscal policy, taxes, trying to look at the definition of the general government, being more transparent when it comes to procurement, when it comes to also elements related to pensions. So there's several similarities when colleagues were discussing the fiscal reforms in the case of Greece. So macro fiscal resilience is the first list of structural reforms. The second is increasing competitiveness and improving the business environment. And here there are many measures that are being taken as well. And then the third is the green transition. So any structural reform that is being done is bucketed under these three categories, because each one of them has an implication on confidence, but also an implication on trying to push some of the sectors which are of interest to us. The green transition is very important to Egypt if we're talking about trying to open up areas for foreign investment, if we're talking about renewables, if we're talking about the green hydrogen, if we're talking about also the food security and water security with desalination. These are very, very important sectors that can push the growth story, but at the same time, they require several reforms from the government side, and that's what's being pushed forward. I want to talk about growth a little bit, because last week we published our growth numbers for the fiscal year that ended in June. Growth levels are 2.4%. That's the growth rate. There's a very important retrenchment in public investment. And the retrenchment in public investment is part of the fiscal consolidation and the fiscal tightening. And it was very, very important because, again, it's a cost we pay to be able to restore macroeconomic stability, but also open up the investment opportunities for the private sector. So when you take a look at the growth rate on the expenditure side, you would see a retrenchment which shows that the seriousness with respect to the fiscal and monetary tightening. The last quarter, we showed an increase in manufacturing once again, and that's on the back of the bottlenecks that were related to the foreign exchange and how that was recovered to a large extent after the policies of March 2024. So that's a positive and expected to continue, notwithstanding, of course, the regional situation. Colleague mentioned also that when we work with international institutions, it's not just about the financing, but it's also about the exchange of knowledge and so forth. Egypt has very strong partnerships with the international community. And when we take a look at our structural reforms, we're also doing them in coordination with development policy initiatives and financing, be it with the World Bank, the European Union, the African Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and many others. And the idea here is that these reforms are part of our national strategy, but at the same time, they are very much highlighted in our strategies with these institutions. And in addition to the financing, there's also, as was mentioned, the technical assistance, the experience, trying always to be in line with international and OECD standards as well. So that is another important aspect of the structural reforms, that they are done in line with our strategies, but also consistent with international practices. Something that we will be doing also and implementing in the period ahead is public investment management systems, so that our colleague, the minister, was mentioning that for different government agencies to get public finance, they had to show their KPIs. That's exactly the monitoring and evaluation of public investments at the ministry's levels, which we are doing as part of the governance of public investment. So there's plenty of similarities in terms of the implementation of policies to overcome as I mentioned, number one, the macroeconomic picture, which is very, very necessary. It's the cornerstone to make all structural reforms make sense, because in its absence, it is going to be very difficult to be able to implement these structural reforms. The second point is to, as was mentioned, reforms are a continuous process, and that's why we already finished a whole list of policies, as I mentioned, related to the 3 pillars: macro fiscal resilience, the green transition, and improving the business cycle. But also, we are continuing on those reforms. And that is with the World Bank pushing with the doing Be Ready report. With OECD, we have additional lists. With the EU, we have another macro financial package, which would also include several reforms that we were going to do anyway, but at the same time, they are able to anchor expectations with respect to the financing going forward. So there's plenty in terms of what we see, what Greece has done. Also something else, tourism was mentioned, and I used to be the Minister of Tourism for a few years and worked with colleagues in Greece on that sector. And it showed extreme resilience despite the different shocks that have taken place. And when you take a look at the growth numbers, tourism has done well. And that is a sector that we want to push further. And as was mentioned, small and medium enterprises as contributors to that sector. We don't have that as much as we want here, but that is going to be an area. And then also entrepreneurship, startups, and this technology. There is a very important report done by the World Bank called the middle income trap, that countries will not be able to move out of that trap without additional investments in both technology and R&D. And that is, again, something that's worked on. I will end my word with just, a challenge that is mentioned globally today for middle income countries. indebtedness levels in general are higher than before, and the quest and the call for reforming the international financial architecture to be able to try and see how that can be mitigated or actually complemented with more concessional finance, so that we can overcome the middle income trap, and we can also overcome many of the shocks that are affecting countries, particularly today when we talk about climate and development. Also, there is a very important finance for development, and that is another big topic that all of us are working on as middle income countries. There's a conference coming up in Spain next June. So finance for development is another way to try and see how we can secure financing, be it from the private sector, from international institutions, from domestic resource mobilization, to be able to push that growth that is much needed so that we don't fall back on our development objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rania, for doing a bit of a comparison and contrast between Egypt and Greece, and for pinpointing the most important areas of reform that we are doing. I'm going to continue with some questions for our Greek colleagues. I hope you're going to be with us. Okay, when you're planning to leave, tell me. Huh? Don't just leave.
No, I was very keen to be online because I wanted to stay till the end of the session. So thank you for accommodating that. And I wish I could be with you physically, but we have the cabinet meeting. It's on the other side. Part of the infrastructure spending is that we have bigger cities in different places, and that is again good for growth. But at the same time, I couldn't be with you on the panel.
You cannot be physically everywhere, but the nice thing about in the administrative capital is that all the ministries are located next to each other. So when we go visit them, we can visit them all very quickly. That's the plus. The minus, I think all the Egyptians know the minus, and Dr. Rania pointed out the minus as well. Okay, let me go back to both of you, talk about Greece a little bit. You said that the reform burned 8 governments, okay, which is very interesting, all right? There is, you also mentioned that the change is not only a technical change, and I agree completely. There's also the cultural change. I would add to it institutional change. I'm sure the way things happen, the way governments operate, and I guess this is why the governments were burnt. Okay, so if you could tell us a little bit about the institutional reform, or the changes in how the way government does things, because pushing for austerity is tough on people. Okay, but it means that governments have to act in a certain way, and austerity measures have to apply to the government as well. So so let's hear more about that. Comments from both of you. Thank you.
Well, in terms of the institutional changes and the way the government operates, I think, and this was, in my view at least, well established in Greece, governments were very weak in terms of the cohesion of the policies and looking at the big picture. I think the consensus now is that you need to have a much stronger center, a much stronger Prime Minister's office to coordinate the policies, and a few people, key people within the government that can actually look at the big picture and ensure that all the different policy measures or initiatives that are taken at lower levels make sense. This is something that is not easily understood, because of course ministers, they need to have their independence and the ability to drive the issues that are close to their heart, etc., etc. But at the same time, we need to have coordination. And I think the changes that we've seen, especially with the Mitsotakis government since 2019, where he explicitly created centralized institutions and a ministry for coordination of the different ministries, was a very, very important reform, and it has worked in practice. More and more, we see that the problems are on a global level, of course, and we need to cooperate between governments. But at the same time, within the government, the problems that we need to face are very much interministerial problems. For example, there's a big discussion in Greece. I'm sure you don't have the discussion in the same terms here about demographics. You mentioned that we lost a lot of people, and we lost 500,000 people, young people in Greece. And we need to rethink about how to reverse the demographic decline. If we don't do anything else, we will be about 8 to 8.5 million in 2060. That means that we have to make a lot of changes, take a lot of policy initiatives in order to ensure that we reverse this decline. You cannot solve that from one single ministry. Even if you create a ministry for family like we did, etc., the policies do not reside in one ministry. Education is important. Fiscally and tax incentives for people to come back, and we have instituted those incentives, and we've seen a return of almost 300,000 people coming back to Greece, people that have left in the previous years. So they work, but they're not enough. You need to have incentives for young families to have kids. You need to provide stability in the economic growth to lower the unemployment, because people will not have families and kids if they cannot afford and they cannot see their future with some kind of predictability. You need to look into the housing crisis and the fact that the prices in Greece, the housing prices are going up and the rental prices are going up. And of course, you cannot have a family if you're 30 and you live with your parents. So you need to move out much earlier than that. So this is one policy area. And I mentioned, 5 or 6 ministries, meaning that a lot of coordination is required if those policies are to be successful. The second thing that I mentioned already is the government has to take back control of its budget. The incentives, at least in the previous decades for Greece, to create extra budgetary items under the radar, hidden costs or hidden pots of funding, etc., is very strong, because that way you avoid the oversight of the Ministry of Finance. But this has to be reversed. Everything has to be in one position. You have to look at the same numbers from different ways. So you have program budgeting, you have green budgeting, you have the normal fiscal budgeting. So you have to look at it from many other ways. And that means that the Ministry of Finance has people referring to it in the different ministries. So you have the special units controlling the budget in the ministries reporting to the Ministry of Finance. So changes to the organizational structure of the ministries, but also technical systems and ERP systems for the government, etc., that are modern and are able to follow those rules. We still have some way to go on that. There's a lot of split budget currently. Our hospitals, for example, the personnel costs are in the Ministry of Finance. The rest of the costs are in the Ministry of Health, etc., etc. So in many cases, we still don't have the right picture. And this is not theoretical. It's not about knowing a number. It's about one person having the total number and being able to lower the total number. Because if 2 or 3 or 4 people have a different part of the number, their incentive is to throw the cost to the other person so that they lower their own number. One person has the buildings, another person has the personnel, a third person has the different procurement costs. So what they try to do is to throw the cost to each other, but the total number doesn't go down. It might actually go up. So you don't actually make any real meaningful change. You just have internal fighting, for example, like that. So those are important, and of course KPIs. Those KPIs have to be as transparent as possible. Again, this is not something that's easy to do, because the incentive for the politicians is to hide those KPIs and only show them when they're favorable to what we've done. If they're good, then we show them. If they're not good, we try to put them under the carpet. This is a natural incentive, but this is not the right way to move forward.
Each country has its carpet. Each country has its carpet, right? Okay. Please.
Okay, so I can say, I guess, 5 quick sentences to surround your question. One is about the government, just to follow up a little bit. A government in different countries can mean different things. A government always also means power. But the days ahead are not easy days. So there has to be a plan, there has to be a structure, and also people that accept to be in the government have to be people that are willing to change, to make things change. If the idea is you go there just to shift power from here to there, that's probably not a great idea even for them. In Greece, we've made some progress, but still not all the progress that has to be made. The second thing is that a country is not just the government. It's also other institutions. And the strength and the independence of other institutions, for the justice system, universities, think tanks, external relationships, are not only checks and balances, are very important for the cohesion of the whole story. We see countries, even as we speak, in Europe and elsewhere, that have very weak governments, yet the strength of the surrounding institutions are such that the countries are doing all right. And I'm thinking of large European economies. So it is very important, I believe, when we're thinking what sort of political architecture is important for the economy, that this is wide, that it has depth. This is not just 20 people running the country. The third thing is that it's important that you have a story and that there isn't too much uncertainty. The numbers that I showed you in Greece, there were macroeconomic imbalances, there were reform gaps, all sorts of things. But what went wrong from day one was that there was no visibility. If you would ask people, how is Greece going to be, next month? Nobody had an idea. We were at the edge of the cliff for 8 years. That's why investment almost disappeared. That's why people left. That's why nobody want to touch this, all right? So to have a story that I may have problems, but that's how I'm going to solve these problems, okay? That's what I can do. That's what I cannot do, all right? But to have a story, that's very important. Fourth thing, even if you have a story, you have to be prepared for things that are going to happen. And I fully agree. She hinted on that, the minister. I'm also worried about imbalances that are building up in the world economy, which, along with the geopolitical stuff, even the last 2 months of the current year may be hard. Nobody knows how the next year is going to be. Global debt of the sovereign is going up. And then when you add the challenges of the green transition, this is not an easy mix. So we should be prepared for challenges. Let's put it this way. That's part of the job. But the last thing, and I said I'm going to say 5 things, and I left the more optimistic one for the end, is that there is always a factor that drives things ahead, and that's technology. And we live at a time when, whether you look into energy, you look into digital, you look into biotech, technology runs. It allows countries that may not be currently at the front line to leapfrog. If you can modernize, for instance, the functioning of your public sector if you want, but now there is a technology. You can revolutionize your healthcare system if you want. Okay, so adapting technologies is the key for making this more sustainable. And this is almost one-to-one. Not only adapting, but becoming part of the technology generation and production process, because that's where the value is. It is not just that this has to be produced necessarily somewhere in California or in Singapore, and then you are a consumer. You have to put yourself within this whole thing. I think that's enough.
Thank you. If you want is the key word, I think, in what you said. If you want is at the heart. And you know, of course, that demographics in Egypt, it's reversed, huh? You guys are looking for people, we have people and we have babies and we can export so many to Houston. No problem whatsoever, and work together and make a bigger output for the world. Okay, let me ask you another question. You talked about the external monitoring by the IMF. Every 50 days they come, they push you. We are also being pushed, okay? And you talked about the IMF cookbook. But the IMF cookbook is always it's a monetary one. So they're looking at the interest rate of the reserves, blah blah blah, not on the institutional part a lot. So this takes me to my point. You mentioned the KPIs. Who's monitoring the KPIs? Government is monitoring its KPIs for sure. Ministries are putting KPIs and measuring them. But outside the government, and you did say, both of you, that the country is not just the government. Where are the people? Where are the civil, society assessing, asking for transparency, assessing the performance, etc., etc.? Where is the monitoring outside the government and inside the country?
No, I think you will say more.
Both of
Yes,
you are going to
you will
answer
say
that
more on
question.
that thing. I'll say one word about the monitoring of the government. For the first time, the Greek government is publishing an annual plan for all the ministries in terms of the investments that they're going to be doing, the kind of reforms they're going to be doing, and the kind of changes in the framework, not necessarily reforms, but wider changes, plus the strategic initiatives that we will take. This is discussed in the cabinet meeting roughly this time, September or October, and it's published. And then, in theory, the wider public is able to see how the ministries perform based on that, and whether we have finished or not finished. And there's a biannual in the cabinet meeting monitoring. So roughly we discussed this in May or June in terms of the implementation. So this is how we open up the discussion about those kinds of KPIs. This is the first time it has happened since 2019, and I think it's one of the very, very important reforms in terms of government accountability. But you can talk about the wider country.
Okay, so let me start with the end of the list. Okay, you ask who is monitoring. In addition to who is formally monitoring, who is important to be monitoring is representatives of institutions like yours, independent researchers and think tanks, journalists. It's important that there is a wider transparency and check of what is happening. But on a formal scale, it's very important that the government has a plan and measures itself relative to the plan. Actually, one of the major reforms that happened in Greece, and you may wonder why it hadn't happened before, at the start of the first adjustment program, was a formal obligation that the government publishes every expense that it makes at every level of the government, actually of the entire public sector, even universities, municipalities. If you want to buy a pen, and you buy a pen with public money, then this has to be published. Right? So it goes to either the Gazette or a website or something. So and that made a huge difference in terms of different pockets of public money that nobody knew that where it was, and then. So this is in terms of transparency and not and how you treat public money, right? But in terms of progress, things things are a little bit more difficult. And now I'm going to say something that is not very pleasant even for the institutional, for the international institutions, because they themselves have their own agendas. And they often have agendas that may be more nearsighted than the country needs. For instance, you may come in and you may propose a recipe that is going to work for 1 or 2 or 3 years. And then after you are gone from your desk, whether you are in the European Commission or the IMF, the problem may return. So it's very important that the design of the program and then how you monitor all this. For instance, in Greece, we implemented very serious reforms in the labor market. Those were preconditions. Basically, the way it worked was that unless, for instance, you open up this profession, then where you're not going to get the money and the country is going to go bankrupt. That's how it worked. However, maybe because it was deemed to be harder, reforms in the product markets were not pushed as much to open up entry into markets, to drop the heavy regulation of the government, to break up cartels and oligopolies. This took much longer time, and this made it harder for the working people to cope. So how you do the balance of all this, if you are in a crisis situation, there has to be a coherent plan that, in some sense, puts in balance the incentives of the government and the foreigners.
Okay. One last question, okay, for you guys.
Dr. Abla, I just want to make an intervention before I go, if possible.
Okay, please.
Yes, just reflecting on some of the interventions that were made. First, with respect to the IMF and how to use the different documents. The merit of having an IMF program, despite all the difficulties, is that there's a report that is always issued with the macroeconomic framework and also a very close accounting of everything that's taking place. And this is really very important for the public debate. And I think everybody in the room can agree that over the past 24 months, there has been an elevation in the debate that takes place, in the discussion around what government should do, what measures should lead to better outcomes. So I think the lively debates that are taking place and very articulated comments from think tanks, from journalists, from the public in general, I think this is something that is taking place, and definitely institutionalizing it going forward is something that we can think about. And of course, ECS is one of the centers as well that does provide these diagnostics. There was a mention on the narrative, the story, own the story. And that is very, very important. And that's why just last week on the growth statistics, for the first time, we issued a press release and a note in both English and Arabic to basically account for why or how the different policies are affecting growth and how we see this going forward. So this is, again, one tool, and we will continue every quarter to have a macro report that basically articulates what has happened, but also, as was mentioned by colleagues on the panel, to own the story and to say, even if there are shocks, what explains the deviation from what you have in mind going forward. Coordination takes place in different ways, and the two key priorities for the government with the new cabinet is industrial development, given its importance with respect to growth prospects and private sector investment. And the second is human capital development. And again, our demographic dividend is very different than what is in Greece, but nonetheless, it is absolutely correct that both industrial development and human capital development is not a single ministry responsibility. It is policies which are cross-cutting. And what is extremely important is that the objectives be articulated and each and every ministry fits within this within this policy agenda or vision. Us as Ministry of Planning, Economic Development and International Cooperation, and I want to emphasize the word economic development because it really is a cross-cutting or a common denominator across trade policy, investment policy, industrial policy, human capital, etc. And so there is, at the government level, different institutional frameworks for this collaboration. And I have to say that the Economic Committee, which was recently with the cabinet change reconfigured, there is a lot of synergy in the messaging, in the policy direction, and also working collectively to ensure that the objectives on the fiscal side, on the monetary side, as well as the drivers of growth are better articulated and mentioned more explicitly. I can go on many topics, but I look forward to maybe visiting ECS at a later stage with a detailed presentation on all of the reforms that I was mentioning and how we see their impact going forward. But again, as it was mentioned, it is up to us to basically take benefit of many of the reforms that are taking place. They are not easy. They are very tough, but at the same time, they're the only way to ensure macroeconomic stability, but also push the structural reforms that are needed for growth and for private and foreign investments. Thank you. And of course, technology transfer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rania. Thank you so much. And thank you for, we are all optimistic about the new government and hoping that things will move faster and differently also in pushing things in the right direction. And I will take you up on your promise to come to ECS and have a detailed presentation and on all that. So thank you so much for your intervention. And I guess we'll leave you in order to catch the cabinet meeting. You mentioned the industrial development, and I think we're going to hear about industrial development tomorrow morning when His Excellency Kamel Wazir comes to meet us. Thank you so much, Dr. Rania. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, bye. Bye-bye now. We're going to continue. I have this small question, and then we're going to open the floor for comments and questions. We have 15 minutes for that. Okay. And please, we need paper and pens for the panelists to write the questions and comments. My last question is, how strong is your parliament? And do you have a decentralization policy? Because we are a very centralized country. And because of that, things don't get implemented easily. So I'm wondering if this has been a problem at all. No, the smiles say a lot here. I was hoping for something positive, but somehow I think it's not coming. But anyways, okay, brief.
Well,
and then
yes, this is a very, very important question. The Greek parliament is very strong in the sense that we have a very diverse parliament, and especially during the crisis. Thank you. Especially during the crisis, we a lot of small parties were formed, created. A lot of changes happened because the crisis led to a mistrust of the old parties. As a result, there was a lot of political engineering, new parties coming up, parties dying, etc., etc. I entered the parliament with one of those small new center parties that currently doesn't exist. So it had its life cycle. And this shows that the parliament is very vibrant. It doesn't mean that necessarily the public discourse and the discussion both within and without the parliament is on a level which is sort of coherent and logical, etc. There's a lot of shouting and crying out and a lot of populism. And the discussions are not always framed in a rational way. So this is a constant struggle and a constant fight that sadly the Western democracies have to fight with. We've seen the problems everywhere in the large countries and the small countries. If anything, Greece was ahead of the curve. Excuse my saying, which has a political stance. I'm part of a specific party. But when we were governed in 2015 until 2019 with a very populist party, they soon realized that they could not implement those populist policies. We had Troika and the rest of the institutions sort of controlling a lot of the things that could or could not be done. And as a result, populism has waned, I believe, in Greece more than what we see in the other countries. We see in the rest of Europe an increase in the extreme right-wing rhetoric, which we see, but not in the same extent in Greece. So Parliament, as I said, is strong. Currently, we're going through a crisis in the opposition. In Greece, the opposition has many problems and is trying to regroup itself. And at the same time, this has led to the governing party's members of parliament, my colleagues in parliament, being much looser because they feel that they can voice their concerns and their opposition. So as a result, we have a opposition within the government party, within the party. So this is a strange situation, but all in all, it means that we have a very strong leader in Kyriakos Mitsotakis, not a lot of discord within the parliament, and we are largely able to implement our reform program. Regional development for Greece is a big problem. We have half the population living in Athens, and if you count Thessaloniki as well, which is the second largest city, two cities, more than half, 55% of the population live there. As a result, there's not a big regional development. Now, Greece is a small country, so decentralization is important in terms of the decision-making, but not crucial in the same sense that it is in bigger countries. We have also tourism that mitigates the problems of regional development. The only areas that have seen a population growth in the last census is the islands because of tourism. So tourism has created a lot of movement of population and a lot of growth in terms of births in the population of the islands because they can sustain the livelihood through tourism. So it's important that economic development goes hand in hand with that. But we're still some way in finding a solution to that problem. I believe there's a discussion since the 80s in terms of consolidation versus decentralization in Greece, and it's been framed as a sort of right-wing versus left-wing policies. I believe that we need a new synthesis, and we need to decentralize a lot of the decision-making, but at least for Greece, we need to centralize a lot of the implementation, because we see that a lot of the municipalities, they're too small and they cannot implement the things that they want to do. For example, water management, waste management, etc. We need to move the implementation up in the value chain, but at the same time, we can lower down the decision making. So the municipalities can decide what kind of roads they want to build and where, but then the road authority can be higher up, implementing those decisions in a much more efficient way. So you can keep the efficiency of the centralized system and the diversity of the decision making of the locals. But this is a new synthesis that we're not there yet.
Thank you so much. You want to add anything here briefly, because we want to open the floor for questions.
Okay, briefly. At the start of the crisis, there was a consolidation of municipalities. There were two waves of that, exactly because they were thought to be too small. So there was one wave that the small ones became a little bit larger, and then the larger became even larger. So the idea was not to dilute power and authority too much. There is still an issue with 11 peripheries of the country. 13, okay. These are there is still no clear balance between what authority they have and what resources, own resources and central resources they have. The government in Greece has historically, after Greece became a democracy in 1974. It has always been strong. Politically, it is now also very strong, the government that is now in power for the last 5 years, and it appears it will be so. The question is how it motivates a broader range of institutions around it so that this gets translated into more change.
Very much. Thank you so much. Now we're opening the floor for comments and questions. We're going to take them collectively so that you can get to respond as you wish, please.
Thank you. Well, I'll make this quick then. So I think in most middle-income economies or even emerging economies, the required reforms are not a big secret. Most people know what they are, but there's often a lack of will, a lack of political will to push them through because of the perceived socioeconomic and political risks to them. Austerity in particular carries a huge political price tag. And I know Greece went through this, so I was wondering if perhaps you could tell us how you coasted through this. And the other very short question is, you mentioned a seismic cultural shift on the attitude towards tax evasion, because tax collection is usually an Achilles heel for most economies. So I'd just like to know how you pulled it off in such a short period of time.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hamad Muhyiddin from the ECS board member. Thank you for your presentation and thank you for giving us an example how you got out of the crisis and gives us hope and like you got out of our crisis here in Egypt. But in Egypt earlier this year, we had a bailout. No, I wouldn't say bailout, but there was like a breakthrough with the deal on Ras Al Hikmah and the donors, international donors, the IMF, World Bank, and the European Union gave us some money. But that came with, as you said, the cookbook with the IMF or whoever is putting the conditions, and it ended up in a very it affects the Egyptian individual, especially in the cost of energy. It's causing a lot of distress. Would you like to give us an example of how much Greece got as a bailout at that time, and what did you do to ease up this pressure on the individual, the regular man, the lame man in the street, especially in the energy crisis? Thank you.
Thank you. One more here, and then we're going to move to this side here. Okay. Dr. Hussein.
Good morning.
I want a working mic on this side.
Thank you for your excellent presentations. Could you talk a little bit more about debt, the external debt that Greece has, how much it was before the crisis? I recall seeing on the presentation 180% of GDP before the crisis. How much is it now? And do you have any difficulty servicing, keeping it at this level, or do you plan to reduce it more?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Please, Professor Bruni, here first. Here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations really for the session, which was very clear and effective. And congratulations to Greece for what you've been able to do. My question is on the intervention of international institutions in managing your crisis, the IMF, the European Union, and well, overall, I got a sort of a positive evaluation by you of all this. I mean, you've been very positive, except for the very last observations that you did about the horizon, which was sort of shorter than needed. Okay, well, this contrasts with a lot of comments that circulate around, especially in Europe, which say, well, you know, Greece has been strangled, has been killed, and there is a lot of criticism that has reached the point that our European stability mechanism is now blocked because nobody wants to listen about the ESM, given that it's considered to be the killer of Greece. I mean, this is false, deeply false. And I wonder if if your judgment, if your positive judgment is sufficiently shared in your country to do something, and it's you that you have to do it, because the IMF and the European Union cannot do it. They are part of the system. You should sort of make a communication effort, maybe a conference, maybe get the Egyptians in Athens, and we will come from Italy, and send a message that after all, there are pluses and minuses, but the success that you had is not only your merit, but it's also the merit of the assistance, the technical assistance, and the suggestions that you had.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Abla. I would like also to thank the speaker for the good quality of their intervention. So my question is in relation with the Greek experience, of course. I would like to say that you have all the condition for the success of this experience. You have a very good democracy, political stability of the political system, very small country. You have also several comparative advantages when we talk about tourism. I would like to focus on, and this is another, let's say, advantage which you have. Greece is a member of the EU. And as such, you received a huge financial and technical financial contribution. So what is the case of Egypt and the other countries? So they don't have this facility. They don't have this specific condition to get grant and to get loans. What are your specific advice for these countries? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have two more questions on this side, then we come back for responses, because I'm going to respect the hour.
وخروج ألمانيا اليونان من الأزمة كان اعتمد على مساعدة ألمانيا في الأول، لأن ألمانيا هي اللي تقريبا تبنت مساعدة الدول المتعرضة لأزمة مالية في الاتحاد الأوروبي للخروج من أزماتها المالية. وكان هدف ألمانيا من المساعدة آنذاك هو حماية الدائنين، يعني مساعدة اليونان في سبيل حماية الدائنين. فبالتالي أنا من وجهة نظري، وده تقريبا أنا استشفيته من العروض اللي حضراتكم قدمتوها، إن المساعدات دي كانت حجر عثرة إن يبقى في حرية في اتخاذ القرار في الجانب اليوناني، وبالتالي إحنا دخلنا في أمراض التعذر زي مصر برضو. وهي نفس الفكرة، إنك أنت اعتمدت على المؤسسات الخارجية، ودي بتأثر على صنع القرار عندك، وعشان تبرر التراجع بتاعك أو إن أنت ما قدرتش تحقق النتائج المرجوة، فأنت بتتعذر بقى سواء بزيادة السكانية أو ويا ريت ده توضح يعني. شكرا.
Thank you. I don't know if you quote the translation, but he said that Greece got the support because Germany protected it and wanted to protect the creditors to whom Greece owed money, and that this is one of the things that sort of led to the support that you got. This is the question. Yeah, behind you. Yes, please. And then Dr. Maha, and then we get the responses.
Okay, thank you very much for excellent, engaging presentations. Actually, I represent two of the institutions you talked about, the think tank, which is the Senate, and I'm a university professor of literature. So I'm very much engaged and very much interested in the cultural aspect. And I'll just add to what you asked about how you change this perspective of tax running away from tax and stuff like that, but also people being engaged in investing only in housing, which is a very major problem here. I mean, we were just discussing this just a couple of weeks ago in the Senate, how we can change the perspective of people, getting the young people, especially in engaging now. They do only fast food, things like that. They're not concerned into doing real industry or investment in other serious things. I wish Dr. Rani had been with us to ask us if they have a vision about doing this in Egypt. And I know there is different culture, but how did you manage to do that? And has this been going on, change for long, or just for the timing of the crisis? Thank you.
Dr. Maha? This is the last question, and then we're going to get the response. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, and I will make it very quick. Actually, it's a comment, not a question. despite the fact that there are a lot of similarities between Egypt and Greece, but I think the main difference that we are still going through a political reform, and it's taking very long time. So when you are doing economic reform at the same time that you are doing democratic transition or political reform, so having the necessary transparency from the government, knowing what they are really doing, publishing their plans and KPIs and all these things, those things are not really available for Egypt. And of course, being a part of the global south with all the problems we are suffering, climate change, all these other things. And of course, we are a huge country with a huge population and some other challenges making us having more difficulties throughout the economic reform. I think we need to benefit from your experience and what you have done, but still we will be having a lot of challenges in doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Mah. Now we come back to you, panelists, all right? A maximum of 5 minutes each in responding to all of the above, because we're taking time from the break. We're taking time from the break, which is scary considering that people came at 8 o'clock in the morning or something. Okay, please.
Okay. Hello?
We'll each cover everything, right?
No, well,
Give
we'll
it your
try.
best shot. And by the way, I mean, we are continuing for 2 days, and many of the topics that are touched are going to be touched in the other sessions. So
I'll try to say one word for each. I'll start with the last comment. Yes, it is a difficult thing. You have to be committed. It's very, very difficult journey. The good thing is that you are the northern countries of the global south. We're the southern countries of the global north. So we're actually closer than we feel that we are. So we're in the same kind of problems. Don't you worry about that. Now, this brings me to the first comment, the political risk. In reality, this was very, very strange and very difficult. I think the Greek people showed a lot more resilience in terms of withstanding the austerity measures and the difficult measures than people would give them credit for. I remember Paul Krugman commenting at that time on the Greek crisis, and he was certain the Greek people would demand leaving the euros in order to get out of the straitjacket of the euro, and this never materialized. And he comes back now and says, I underestimated the ability of the people to withstand, to understand and withstand those kind of problems. The shift in terms of, I'll refer to both questions, the shift in terms of culture happens very, very quickly during an acute crisis. I would like to take credit that we engineered that, the political class, but in reality, we didn't. It's the crisis, the huge crisis that really forced everyone to reevaluate their way of life, their beliefs and everything like you never do in normal times. So this is how we shifted our views and allowed a lot of those things to happen. The conditionality in terms of energy wasn't a problem back then. It wasn't our focus. So it wasn't a problem. But the problems were other problems, like we lowered pensions by more than 50%. My father, who was a medical doctor in the Greek Air Force, lost 60% of his pension. So I had to give him money every month suddenly. So his whole way of life collapsed. So we try to ease up for the lower tier. Sometimes this is unfair because you give to those people that did not contribute with contributions. They normally get the lower pensions. So it's actually unfair, but this is something you have to do because you have to at least protect a minimum way of life. The numbers in terms of debt, we started with debt around 120, 130%. That's when the crisis started. Our debt peaked 180 within the financial crisis, 207% during COVID because our debt increased. We lowered debt since 2020, the peak 207 to today, 45 percentage points in 4 years. That's more than 10, 12% per year. So this is huge. And our recently published 4-year plan calls for another debt reduction of 20 percentage points by 2028. So we're continuing not with the numbers that we've seen, about 5% per year, but we're continuing on a downward path. Pretty soon in 2026, 27, we will not be the country in Europe with the highest debt. Italy will be, we will be the second highest debt. So this is a very, very positive trend that we're having. Yes, all in all, my view is that the evaluation is positive in terms of the work that the institutions have done. Unfortunately, the only thing I would change is that to give more precedence to the European view compared to the intergovernmental view. Governments were unfortunately very antagonistic. The German government had to go to the German parliament and talk to the German people about the German taxpayers' money and stuff. And that led to a much more punitive approach in the initial phases. We were lent with 6.5%, the first loans. Very high interest. And of course, if that continued, the programs would never be financially a success. So that, as trust was restored, that progressively changed. And I think the Greek public has a much more balanced view, not necessarily a positive view, much more balanced view in terms of what with this. And a final word about the last comments. So I already answered whether the whole thing was about strangling. The Greek decision-making was still there within the confines of the fiscal space that we had. So we could do roughly what we wanted to do, but we had two constraints. One, we had to prove that this was effective compared to our goals. So we couldn't just do whatever came up to our mind. And of course, we had a very specific fiscal envelope that we could work with. So now what to do other countries that don't have the kind of the EU club that Greece is part of? I know it's much more difficult. Remember that the euro removed the devaluation ability from the IMF cookbook. So IMF really improvised a lot with Greece because it did not have the normal policy tools that they normally ask for. So this is a double-edged sword. You have devaluation, which politically it's much, much easier. We had to increase taxation by more than 100%. We had to lower the salaries of the public sector employees and the pensions. So we had to both cut expenditure and increase revenues because we could not hide it under inflation, under devaluation, and get the money the other way around. So you have more tools at your disposal, but you need to have more political will than we did because the institutions were much more stronger in our case. That was as quickly as I could.
The political will is the key word. Please.
Yeah. It feels a little bit strange, this whole thing. It's like going to the psychiatrist and then he tells you, you know, relax and tell us about your fears and problems, right? What happened when you were a child? Right? And it brings back stuff that, you know, people like us, we now want to see Greece moving ahead, and we're discussing a lot more about, you know, 99% of what we talk about is about the future. But it's very important not to forget.
In that case, you are the doctor. Okay, we are the patient, so feel free.
Okay, let me start with the end, which was a kind of a question about the political terrain. Look, no country can grow in a sustainable way without respecting and engaging its citizens at the fullest level. Even if you do it temporarily, you're going to lose them soon. I think yesterday the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics was announced, and it had to do with why the quality of institutions is important for growth. We had Daron Acemoglu at TOV last year talking to us about this stuff. So I'm with you if I understood your question correctly. Let me say something about the question about debt. The Greek debt is a very strange creature. It is still high. However, it is very long run. And the cost of servicing it has been capped. In that sense, what happened during the programs was not that the Greek problems were solved, the Greek debt problem was solved, but Greece was given the tools and the time, 20, 30, 40 years, once it gets stronger to manage it. So if you look at the numbers, it still looks the highest, but servicing the debt is not something that is burdening the Greek economy now, and it will not, at least for the next 5 years. I wanted to say also something about, of course, the help and the intervention of the foreign institutions has to be acknowledged, but that doesn't mean that they didn't make mistakes, and especially mistakes that undermine their credibility. When the first IMF program started in 2010, the IMF told the Greeks that this is the plan, and in 1 or 2 years, you will be out of the woods. And in 2 years, the situation was worse. And it was partly because this was a wider problem, pan-European, but it was also partly due to mistakes that the IMF itself had made. So many of these mistakes would not have been made if the Greek political class was more engaged and more responsible. So you have to tell them what is the problem. You have to explain what are the boundaries of what you can and what you cannot do. But certainly no country is an island. And you have to it will be unwise not to get the help, the financial help, but also the technocratic help. The same goes about the participation in the EU. Participating in a group of strong economies, of course, gives you credibility, it gives you good trade conditions, but at the same time, it removes some degrees of freedom in terms of whether you can do industrial policy, whether you can keep your people in, stuff like that. The whole plan of the EU, and then with the euro as a tool, is that the European economy will become more and more and more integrated, in the sense that you will not, that maybe not now, but in 10, 20, 40 years, you will not be talking about German or French or Greek businesses or Spanish or Dutch or Cypriot universities, but all this is going to be mainly European. So to give advice, as we were asked, to what larger economies, but with more degrees of freedom, can do, this is a long discussion. I would be happy to expand in another occasion, but I don't want to. But I want to return to the one word that I think we all use, which is the credibility of these policies. And very often, if you cannot, it is not easy to change a country. There are ways to do it. The sequencing of changes is important. It's important that, an economy is a system, in the sense that you cannot say that I'm just going to change this, but I'm gonna let everything else unchanged, because this is not gonna work. But to build credibility, you have to show that you can deliver. And going in areas where there are problems, and you say, I'm gonna intervene, I'm gonna do this, and if not in 1, in 2 or 3 years, I'm gonna show you result. I don't know if for Egypt this is healthcare, if this is pensions, if this is education, if this is, but start from somewhere and do something where people are gonna say, aha, it works. So these people, they had good intentions and they delivered. And then you have built credibility for the future.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a great note, positive note to end with. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.